Good evening. My name is Matthew Ogden. I'm an editor with LaRouchePAC.com. I'd like to welcome everybody watching to a live broadcast from LaRouche PAC TV. This is our weekly Friday evening live internet webcast with Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. Now, before we begin tonight, let me just mention briefly that even prior to tonight's broadcast, Mr. LaRouche has received some significant attention today in an interview published by the Washington Times. This is part one of a two-part interview titled Lyndon LaRouche Explains How America's Economy Can Be Revived Again. This was part one, published today, and we presume that part two will be published tomorrow. Now, this is a significant interview, but I'm sure that the contents of this interview will be elaborated much more fully by Mr. LaRouche in tonight's broadcast. We will be following the usual format. After Mr. LaRouche's opening remarks, we will have questions and answers. Joining us in the studio tonight are Jason Ross and Dennis Mason to present those. So, without further introduction, I'm proud to give to you Mr. Lyndon LaRouche.
Well, so I'm given. Well, there are 3 points which we have to take up together, and they're the most urgent things to be put before the bodies which are going to be meeting during the course of this next week. And that is, the problem we face, which is urgent, is the world as a whole, especially the transatlantic region, is building up for an explosion of hyperinflation. Therefore, the most important item on the agenda of the United States in particular, and nations of Europe in general, is to immediately install a completely new financial economic system to the United States. To postpone that task for something other consideration would be a great folly. We have no time to waste. The hyperinflation is about to explode. And the only thing that will stop the hyperinflation as of now would be the immediate adoption first of Glass-Steagall. That's measure number 1. Measure number 2 is establishing the financial system, the new financial system, which is required to implement the Glass-Steagall legislation in a timely fashion. And thirdly is to incorporate in the same package a program which is not only NWAPA, the greatest project that was ever undertaken by any part of the world today, was NWAPA. It was ready to go at the time that John F. Kennedy was about to be assassinated. It was postponed because of the war and never put into effect. But this is the greatest construction measure ever considered and undertaken by mankind. It may be a little bit old in some respect, but the version we're going to present for this action is an updated version where new scientific principles have been added to the repertoire of NWAPA. And this is the greatest water project ever conceived by mankind. There may be greater ones which follow at some time in the future if we get this thing done now. But that's the first part. Now, NWAPA and the resolution of the financial reorganization which NWAPA requires will come in as a secondary feature, because we're going to have to build, in addition to NWAPA, we're going to have to rebuild a complementary element which is not directly included in the original NWAPA. That is the area of the automobile industry, or the machine tool sector of the automobile industry capability, which is also an aircraft sector. This is also absolutely necessary, because in putting NWAPA into effect, we are forcing ourselves to go to the engineering capabilities beyond NWAPA, which are to be found in the automobile industry's machine tool capability, which means that we're talking about approximately 6 to 8 million jobs started almost immediately by this kind of reform. So the 3 things are, first of all, Glass-Steagall in the original Roosevelt form must be implemented now, preferably this week, this coming week. That should be the urgency. That's the first order of business which must be addressed. Because if we don't do this, we're on the verge of a hyperinflationary explosion. And once it starts, it won't stop. So if you want to save the United States now and save civilization, you adopt NWAPA in the United States. Now, we're on the edge also that in Britain there is a majority of the banking industry which is ready to go with NWAPA. They have their own reasons for doing it, but they certainly are going to take the opportunity of using a NWAPA project launched in the United States and also with the Glass-Steagall measure. They're going to take the advantage of that because the English sector cannot recover without a complement. And that's what you find. Leading circles in the British banking system are thinking properly of NWAPA now, because they recognize that the only way they can save the British economy, that is the United Kingdom economy, is by having a coordinated action between the United States and Great Britain, or the Great British Banking. Now, the one thing about NWAPA is it solves the essential problem in principle. It eliminates some things that should be shot, whatever that means. But it does not solve the problem by itself. And that's a mistake that most people who are talking about NWAPA fail to understand. Because what's going to happen is, in the institution of NWAPA, we are immediately going to find ourselves in a situation where the project doesn't work as a whole by itself in terms of this. But what it requires is an activation of funding. Now, for example, we're going to require, with Glass-Steagall, we're going to require some mechanism of producing credit to go into circulation. Otherwise, you will be stuck there with a successful reform, but without the means to implement the results, the benefits of that reform, which means we need a new credit system to complement Glass-Steagall. That means we're going to have to create a credit facility which would generate the lendable credit which is going to be used for the revival of the economy. A large part of that lendable credit will go into measures which involve NWAPA, and that makes NWAPA a feasible project immediately. But that is not enough. We also have to have a source of employment in two categories, in particular, which will create the stimulation which will put that credit into operation. So the first thing is these three elements have to come together. And they do, we're on the road to recovery. Because if the United States does this, in the three factors, that is, first of all, is Glass-Steagall per se, a revision. Second is the creation of a new source of credit, of datable credit. And that source of datable credit will enable us to launch a recovery immediately. That doesn't mean the full results are going to come immediately, but we're going to be going down the right road in the right direction, and probably speeding a little bit. And then finally, we need the complementary federal projects, of federally authorized, federally backed projects, which will give us the financial growth and the related physical growth needed to restart the United States on its road. That action is likely will have the effect of raising people's hopes in the United Kingdom and other places to do the same thing. And if the United Kingdom does that in cooperation with the United States, you will find that the nations of continental Europe, which are now about to disintegrate into hyperinflation, will really quickly jump on board on the same process. And under those conditions, I believe we can solve the leading problems of the coming years, of the immediate coming years. And these are problems which could kill us and blow us off the water before the beginning of the next year, which is almost now. So everything else goes on this, on the lower schedule. This must happen first, because if you don't do this first, you're not going to do anything worthwhile second. So therefore, you have to put in Glass-Steagall, hoping that the British, as they promise implicitly, will jump aboard, and they have no option but to do that, if they're sane. And I think some of them are sane, at least on these matters. That operation, when combined with a means, a federal means, to utter credit, which is based on time schedule, just like the original system of the United States. To create the credit, that's a federal responsibility. So we have to create a banking institution, which is a federal credit system, which operates under credit laws, as under some precedents which were used as by Alexander Hamilton and some of his followers at that point. Thirdly, we have to actually have some projects, major projects, which have the sufficient aptitude and other qualities in order to get a real recovery started fast. That does not mean we're going to have a gigantic relief and solve all problems suddenly. It means we're going to get started down the road. And when you started down the road under a credit system, as opposed to a simple money system. See, money, when you spend money, that's the end of it, as you should probably know by now. So therefore, when you extend credit by giving us, say, or this credit will be matured for resolution, say 10 years from now, or 15 years from now, based on the nature of the projects. And what will happen is the federal government, in cooperation with other institutions, private and public, is going to work out a scheme whereby the allocation of credit from the time it's uttered to the time until it is redeemed will be arranged. And on that basis, we will have an organized recovery of the United States under a credit system. And that by being supplemented by other elements of a credit system, which is NWOPA particularly. NWOPA is the big driver. NWOPA is not only a driver because it creates jobs, it increases power, restores our system of agriculture and other kinds of things, which will not happen without it. There will be never any recovery of the United States in your lifetime, or probably your children's lifetime, unless we now act in the instant before hyperinflation throughout the Western world, throughout the transatlantic region, is about to hit. And we must take this action now, this coming week, as much as possible. First on the agenda, nothing of higher rank on the agenda pertaining to money systems and so forth. And that's what we require. And that's the revolution which can save the United States from hell. And I do mean hell. And that's the first job. Once we do that, and once we change the attitude of certain governments in Europe, the obvious implication is this. Continental Europe, Western and Central, is in the process of disintegration. Hyperinflationary disintegration. It's on the edge of hyperinflationary now, on the hyperinflationary phase, now. So talking about several weeks down the lane, or when it's possible, or maybe by April or some foolish thing like that, or we got other legislation which is more important, crap it, forget it. It's not more important, because we're already into the explosion of hyperinflation, and we must act immediately to stave that off. And we have the means to do so. There's a wide basis of support for Glass-Steagall in the United States, of course, but also in some elements in Europe. And we need a financing system, a credit system, not how much what you can get delivered to you, but what you get on contract agreement. And we will select projects which are urgent and provide credit for things that are otherwise deemed to be important or highly important. So that's the first thing to do. We've got to get the world out of hyperinflation. And this is the only way to do it. And the only way to do it is with the United States first. And then I think the United Kingdom will join. And other nations will join. Now this will also mean, all logically, and you have to look at the implications of what we're doing. You can't simply say this is a fine thing to do and then walk away from it and say it's done. You've got to think about the implications of what you've done, what you've stated. And that means you've got to start thinking about organizing the projects which are going to employ the people, which represents the recovery. Using the credit authorized under the system to provide a sudden turn from destruction to growth. This means that you have to have command projects NWAPA is a command project. As I said before, it's the greatest project ever undertaken by any nation in magnitude and in effect. It will change the entirety of the central and western parts of the United States. It will mean a growth of water. It will mean an end of starvation of the land areas. It will mean the multiplication of the magnitude of water available, because NWAPA not only uses water and circulates it, NWAPA increases the net amount of water available for consumption at any time from the immediate sources. And this project, when complemented by going with what we might call a new Detroit project, that is, NWAPA covers a lot of things, particularly on the western part of the United States. But we also need a revival of the kind of machine tool technology which we used to associate with the automobile industry and the aircraft industry. We have lost much of the machine tool capability which that represented. We are going to have to restore the highest and most modern capabilities of the same type again. So there's your three projects, just to repeat that. First, Glass-Steagall as such. That is not by itself going to save anything. It may save your conscience, it may save your marriage, or other good things like that. But it's not going to solve the problem. What you have to have is a credit system, which we don't have now. But we've had it before in U.S. policy. We're going to restore that idea of the credit system, which means that the federal government will guarantee, on negotiation, on merit, where it's warranted, the federal government will utter the credit, which will date from the time the credit begins to work until the point the credit is repaid. That may be several years, it may be 10 years, it may be 20 years. We're going to do the same thing with the financing of the machine tool capabilities of the United States, and also other countries, obviously. And that's the project. And if that project is started this coming week, as it should, because this is the opportunity to do so, this is the time when the agenda of the new incoming Congress is going to work. That is the point to do this. Do it immediately, first on the schedule, right away. And I can assure you that if that is done, the United States will be saved. And if we do it, other parts of the world will join. Because I tell you what you're facing. You're facing, if you let this thing go and keep fooling around with this, you're going to find you got nothing and no hope. Because we've got a hyperinflationary surge which is about to take off, is ready to go. And the next time that idiot does another flotation of credit, we're gone. So we've got to stop it now, restart the thing on a new basis, and get to work. And we'll find that with that, there's another characteristic. We've got a mess in Europe. And this mess in Europe, on continental Europe, if this mess on continental Europe is not cured, it'll drag the rest of us down. So the Euro system is, in any case, no matter what we do here, the Euro system is about to disintegrate. Now, the loss of Europe, that is Western and Central Europe, a breakdown of Western and Central Europe on the kind of hyperinflation that hit Germany in 1922-23, is about to hit in Europe immediately. And therefore, only if we organize with the United States and set in motion a recovery action of this type, a Glass-Steagall type of action, then we have a chance of saving Europe. Otherwise, all kinds of hell are certain to burst loose in a very short period of time ahead. But this week, this coming week, is the moment of the great opportunity. Have we got the guts and brains to decide to push through NWAPA as a part of the program of recovery which Glass-Steagall is supposed to represent? That is the key. That must come first, completely defined first. Then we do the rest. And once we do that, and with other nations which can participate, like I think the United Kingdom could, or probably Canada as well. But until that is done, there's no hope for the rest of the world, that especially Europe. And that means that Europe is going to be faced with the problem of scrapping the present system because it's so rotten with hyperinflation and hyperinflationary explosion that there's no chance that you could save the euro system. The euro system, which is a nation-stateless system used instead of a government of people, is the great danger which we must also deal with in order to make what we're trying to do in the United States successful.
Thank you very much. You're watching a live broadcast with Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. And let me just say before we get to our questions, the subject matter which Mr. LaRouche just discussed is available for your use in organizing in two locations particularly on the website. Number one, we've published a pamphlet called the three-part Full Recovery Program for the United States, which covers these three aspects. That's available. It's under the title Platform for a New Presidency, and also a special report on NWAPA 21, authored by Michael Kirsch and others. Now, I would like to ask Dennis Mason to come to the podium to pose the first question.
Okay. The first question that I have here comes from a contact in Washington, D.C. on the question of the debt. Before I ask the question per se, I want to kind of situate it. The Congress is coming back into session scheduled for this Sunday evening on the questions of the fiscal cliff. And as far as we can tell, the whole place is abuzz with questions of bailout and continuing to austerity policy. Adding to this, Tim Geithner sent a letter to the Congress saying that come January 1st, the debt ceiling will be reached, but he could pull $200 billion out of a hat to try and extend that. So this is the environment which is in Washington, D.C. right now. At the same time, as you had said in your remarks, Europe is completely disintegrating. There's been a major push recently out of Italy, Germany, and France for a financial dictatorship centered out of the European Monetary Union, centered out of Brussels. And as part of this, the Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Monti, who was installed, it's now looking like he's going to be running to be voted in as Prime Minister, and he's put out a 25-page manifesto on this idea of consolidating a dictatorship under financial auspices for Europe. So you have that, but at the same time, you know, as Matt mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, your interview was published in the Washington Times on the question of, you know, explaining how America's economy can win again, is how they titled it. With, at the same time, the Financial Times ran a poll. They took a poll in Britain, the House of Commons, and found that within the House of Commons, there's 60% of them who explicitly are in support of a Glass-Steagall. Now, this comes on top of what they published last weekend on this question of an actual separation of the banks. So in this context, I want to read the question from the questioner per se, and they say, regardless of the outcome of the fiscal cliff showdown, barring a fundamental change in U.S. policy, the national debt will reach somewhere between 22 and 25 trillion by the end of a second Obama term. Now, this clearly is an impossible situation. Now, what is to be done to actually solve this much bigger debt crisis? The thinking in Washington all revolves around austerity, an approach that has already failed to solve the European debt crisis. What are your alternatives?
I'm pleased to take this question up. First of all, we do not owe that money, and we shall not owe it. And that's a promise that if they do what I tell them to do now, they won't have to do the other dirty thing down the line later. That's the deal. In other words, if they do the right thing, we're not going to kill them, either as meat or as by financially. What's going to happen is a lot of the debt is going to vanish down the toilet. The greatest flushing sound in history. Because this money is worthless. It's toilet money. It's nothing in it. There's no value in it. How can you redeem things that have no value? How can you eat from an empty bowl? How can you drink from an empty glass or an empty wine glass? Even a whiskey glass. You can't. There's nothing there for you. It does not exist. It's not redeemable. And the basis of a sound economy is to have it organized on the basis of redeemable expenditures, redeemable assets. It means that you're trying to use technological progress to increase the productivity of labor so that you get an input where you hire people at a certain price and their machines and other things and raw materials. But you'll find out because you transform this material into something more valuable intrinsically than you started with, that's the basis of growth. For example, you take a person, you hire them to do a job. If they do nothing, you've wasted your money. The idea of transforming a population as a labor force into work and to similar kinds of things is precisely that work they're going to do is going to increase the productivity of production. And therefore you're going to earn more by producing than if you sat there swapping money. The idea of swapping money as a way for running an economy is an idiot's illusion. So the crucial thing here is what I've already specified and just what I've spoken of here. First of all, get Glass-Steagall through. That means that everything that doesn't qualify with a Glass-Steagall debt is not honorable by the U.S. government and by the system of government. It becomes trash that you have to, sell off as trash, as redeemable values of trash. So what we're doing, we're going back to a sane economy as opposed to an intrinsically insane one. And I think if you try to sell Geithner, you would find you got no proceeds from the sale. There's nothing he can offer or do that's of any use to the human species. In fact, I think his efforts are of a negative value. It's like a great sucking sound that some people talk about. It's just sucked down. So the point here is if we do the 3 steps, and if we reach out to other parts of the world to say, we're getting rid of this garbage, this hyperinflationary garbage, this speculation is over. It's not worth anything. There's not a single bank engaged in this speculation which can produce values, actual values, which in net effect amount to anything except a shrinking of the income, for the physical income per capita. So what they're doing as the growth of money is actually has a negative effect on the national economy. We want to focus the productivity of the economy on the basis of those kinds of actions which create something which is going to be worth more in the future than today. It's more in the future not because of inflation, but quite the contrary. It's worth more in the future because as you improve productivity, less effort, net effort by the people, results in greater product by their production. And the more people that are productive, the greater the nation is. And that was the way on which our republic was founded, and besides some mistakes that were made by Jefferson and others, and especially, the evil crowd that came in 1928 or 1828, that we get rid of that. So that's the point. We have in our hands, on the basis of an attitude by us, to extend our policy as a policy of orientation toward cooperation. I'm sure we can get a first-hand agreement with Britain on such a reform. They've indicated it strongly. 60% of the Commons indicate that direction. It's a very strong pitch, and there's no hope for the United Kingdom without it. They go in the soup too. The problem, as I said, the real problem we have to face is the fact that under the Euro system, which is already in a hyperinflationary, explosionary form, there's no hope for Western and Central Continental Europe unless we reform that too. If the United States and the United Kingdom agree on this particular reform, and there's strong indications from the Commons that the United Kingdom would agree, then we have the means, by a negotiation with Russia and China and India, and so forth, we have the means to create the circumstance, the market circumstance, for a recovery of the economies of Western and Central Europe, continental Europe. And of course there's Africa, but the point is the whole issue of Africa and of the Middle East, which is now a hellblot, the whole issue there is we need programs which are international programs which can feed into the needs of Africa and feed into the redemption of other areas which need it. That's, I think, is the summation of what the situation is.
Okay, I have a kind of a follow-up question for that, which is on the question of food, the food crisis. The mayors put out their end-of-year report every December, and this one, taking a cross-section of the United States with 25 different cities, they're looking at more and more people within the cities going to the different food pantries. This is an increase in every single one of those cities polled except for one. The food pantries themselves are running low, and you have the situation where people are getting more cheap food, which has less nutritional value. So at the city level, we see this, and most of the mayors expect it to get worse. And as we've covered on the LPAC site, looking nationally and internationally, we're looking at a actual concrete shortage in grains. Now, there is a agricultural website which published the following yesterday. They said, according to the U.S. Drought Monitor, 2/3 of the country is classified as abnormally dry or experiencing some level of drought. The most severe level of exceptional drought happens to be over the Ogallala Aquifer, which is the irrigation source for more than a quarter of the United States. Now, with a large portion of the hay and corn supply produced in this region, conditions here will influence the cost of feed and the cost of production for dairy producers already. Already, cow numbers are dropping by the thousands in the West and the Southwest. For California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, the total decline in cow numbers is more than the rest of the country combined. Now, while dry conditions raise havoc domestically, a leading dairy exporter to the south is experiencing the opposite extreme. Rainfall and flooding in Argentina have pushed out the planting, and with the worldwide grain stores already low, a potential shortage could mean an even greater vulnerability when it comes to input costs. So there's been a lot of coverage of milk prices, as an example, being close to doubling. And during the entire time, the Farm Bill is just sitting there in the Congress. And it's not like this crisis has just come out of nowhere. The entire year we've had a lot of extreme weather, a lot of warnings from all sides, and the Obama administration has done nothing, whether it's in the case of the Army Corps of Engineers who could come in to do emergency things, or putting a moratorium on the ethanol mandate. These kinds of things, Obama has done nothing. So I'd like to address this food crisis because it's coming more to the surface.
Right. Well, first of all, the whole thing is a fraud. So it's not worthwhile considering some of the arguments that are being made or reports that are being made, because the whole thing is a fraud. The first thing we're going to have to do right now, as of tomorrow morning or any proximate time, we're going to cancel the use of edible food for synthetic fuels. We'll just cancel the whole program. No more synthetic fuels using materials which are edibles, essentially, using sources of food. We are not going to do that. We're not going to convert food into gasoline or anything resembling it. You want gasoline, you're going to have to buy it on a separate market. You're not going to take food and transform that into fuel. That's being foolish, very foolish. So that's the point in this thing. This must be canceled immediately. Now, this is going to cause a big ruckus. But the problem is we have not had any options to encourage the sane citizens of the United States, who are getting hungrier and hungrier and more in danger of starving, in order to feed the egos of stupid people who think that by lowering the productivity of labor that you're going to increase the production of food. So the whole green program is going to be scrapped in large degree, all these features of it. The first thing we're going to do is cancel all this substitutes by converting fuel into fools, and fools into fuels. So that's the point. Don't fool with this. Cancel it. It has to be canceled tomorrow morning. Everything that Obama is insisting on has to be canceled tomorrow morning on that issue. We are not going to starve either our people, nor are we going to starve the livestock on which that depends, nor are we going to continue to destroy the sources of foodstuffs which are grown in our territory and developed in our territory. That's canceled. Take them out, hang them out, use the guillotine, whatever it's to do. Get rid of that stuff because it has to be done now. Too many human lives depend upon doing that. And we want the people who want to do it to tell us how many people they want to kill and how much they're going to be convicted of for doing it.
Yeah. I suspect many of them would be happy to tell you how many people they want to kill, because it's not an accidental side effect of their policies. If the intention is to depopulate the planet, ethanol fits right in. I want to switch gears a bit and discuss the strategic situation, because there is a very significant shift going on in the response of the Congress, which I think is important for getting these economic policies put through. But on the subject of Benghazi, Syria, and then Russia, at the time that Gaddafi was killed, you had said that the next immediate targets would be Syria and Iran, with the real goal of causing chaos and conflict with Russia, which is a conflict that serves no legitimate American interest, but a geopolitical one instead. So, just on Benghazi, the situation with Benghazi, that's still red hot in the Congress. At least that's what we found with the hearings the last week, where the questioning was shaped by the report that we had put out and that we had gotten out in D.C. about how basically the same al-Qaeda groupings that were involved in the original 9/11 they were used in places like Libya. They now are operating against us in Syria. This is tied in with the killing of Ambassador Stevens. But you ask yourself, what is the possible benefit of involvement in Syria? Where is this supposed to go? What good could come out of toppling Assad and putting in place a new regime approved by the U.S.? Well, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, said that if there's to be any sort of new government, there has to be a broad negotiation. Rebel groups, the current government need to sit down, they need to negotiate, which is not something the U.S. has said. Instead, U.S. officials have said that Assad is going to go, that the rebel groups don't have to discuss with the current government, that they should basically be given political control. Now, there is an interesting article written by Chris Hedges called Egypt's New Pharaoh, where he recounts what's happened in Egypt. You know, we've had the whole Arab Spring. We've had some time to see how things sort out. What's been the upshot? What took place in Egypt? Well, Hedges writes that the moderates, who are crucial to winning the support of the masses and many outside of the country, become an impediment to the consolidation of autocratic power. Liberal Democrats, intellectuals, the middle class, secularists, and religious minorities such as Coptic Christians were always seen by Morsi and his group as useful idiots. They were essential to building a broad movement to topple Mubarak, but now they're a hindrance to single-party rule, and these groups are being crushed. The Muslim Brotherhood doesn't intend to dilute its power, and secularism is on the wane, as poor believers are brought into the streets to attack the new enemies of the revolution, so-called. It's like the French Revolution, not exactly a dazzling success. So you'd say, what are we hoping to achieve in Syria? What better future are we trying to offer to the Syrian people? And then think about Turkey, where these 3 batteries of Patriot missiles are on the way to be established in this region that has little to do with defending Turkey from Syria, as obvious to everybody looking at it, but it's targeted at Iran. And if you think about it, you've got Russian military defense systems in Syria. Like the Patriot batteries, these are likely manned by Russian soldiers. So the potential for the direct causing of casualties of Russian soldiers exists. What would be the consequence of that? So basically, to ask the question on Russia is, going back to what you had said that I'd quoted in the beginning about after the murder of Gaddafi, the U.S. is operating under this Tony Blair responsibility to protect outlook. And this is just heading for a serious collision between the U.S. and Russia. This spells for the potential of use of thermonuclear weapons. So, could you speak to the motives that are lying behind what appears to simply be a completely senseless, insane, and useless policy on the part of the United States?
One of my specialties for a long time in intelligence work has been based on the role which led the great Chancellor of Germany out of office and thus set into motion what became known as World War I. Bismarck. Bismarck had, at the time of relevance, 2 years before his ouster, had been the keystone in preventing the foolish old doddering Kaiser of Austria from starting World War I as a Balkan War. And what happened is Bismarck, who was very well tuned in to Russian connections and who was much more trusted by Russians than any other person in Germany, particularly any other official person, just got in a position where they, that is Bismarck and the Tsar, the Tsardom, under two Tsars, had assured Russia that Germany would not participate, would not support, and would not tolerate an effort by the British to organize the silly old Kaiser of Austria together with other elements in the Caucasus, or not in the Caucasus, but in that area. That was the peace. That Bismarck had blackmailed the British and British government, a regime, into not going to war, because he made that war not feasible by having a cooperation agreement between Prussia and Russia. So what the British did is they got a new Kaiser in, replacement for the old. And the new one, after a short period of time, dumped Bismarck. Within 2 years, the removal of Bismarck set into motion the beginning of World War I. And that continued with a little regression there for a moment in the 1920s, leading into World War II along a similar line. What we're doing now, if you look at the history of warfare, modern warfare in Europe and beyond, in terms of world wars and reference points in between, you'll find there's a continuation, a continual process, which is repeated now 3 times. One, from 1890 through World War I, with a respite in the 1920s. World War II launched effectively during the course of the 1930s, and that went on as indicated. That was continued under Truman, by Churchill and Truman, which prevented an effective peace from being established. So we had these right-wing movements in the United States which terrorized the United States, its population, and then in comes a president, Kennedy, who is sponsored to be elected by Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Shortly after that, powers that be in London and in the United States killed Kennedy. They assassinated him. And they took the precaution of assassinating his brother Robert at a later point. The immediate effect was to go into the green movement of the 1970s and into economic games, which was destroying the United States economy. It's been destroying it ever since, despite the efforts of some people to change that. So what we're on the road to is the same kind of thing. We're going through a reenactment of the sequence of World War I. It's a different schedule, different events, but the package is the same. The British start a set of war, the British Empire starts a war. It spreads it. It involves destruction, large-scale destruction of certain parts of the world. Germany was the first target to be destroyed. That was the intention. And it never really fully recovered from that ever since. France is also similarly destroyed now today, virtually destroyed. Spain and Portugal are now being crippled. Greece, unspeakable area. Italy is about to go into the same thing. So this is the process that's underway. It's a known process. The fact is, here's the problem. We have recently, and it broke out under George Bush Jr. In his first term. I warned about it on the 3rd of January of that year. Said it was going to happen. That a terror operation was going to break out during that year, which would lead to a great conflict. That was 9/11. Right? Now, look at what 9/11 was. And then look at what has happened in Benghazi, in Syria. You have to understand what is really going on here. You can't just make comments, good or bad or so forth. You've got to understand a process, not a sequence of events, but a process. It's a process based on the tomfoolery of the average citizen, the average head of government. The average politician is a fool. In this matter, is a fool. They think that this is the issue. You've got a conflict. Well, this is the issue. It is not the issue. The issue is the damn foolishness of the people who believe it's the issue. Because the way these things are done, they're based on the fact that the human being acts like a chicken. They don't know where the future is going. They're pecking for worms in the ground and mistaking the fact that the butcher is coming to get them. And that's the nature of these kinds of things. And that's what's happening to us. The British started how? They started what became World War I. They started it in 1890. And it was built up with crises in France, a change in the character of the French government by assassinating the president of France, and similar kinds of things, going into what? The next phase was in 1893, you had the launching of a war by Britain in alliance with Japan against China. That led into the 1905 war of the same forces with Russia in the eastern part. That went into the 1905 revolution as such. That went into all the other kinds of wars, including Balkan wars, which were spread. And suddenly one day, with all these stupid people and politicians and press saying, "Oh, the problem's going to be solved." 2 days later, the drums of August, World War I broke open. That continued. It never went away. The machinery of process of warfare, under imperial conditions, continued. We have been living under those kinds of imperial conditions, regressions, resurgences, and so forth, up to the present time. And that's where the problem lies. That's what you have to think in terms of. Don't try to think in terms of action-reaction. The problem of the typical American, like the typical European, very few of them understand the process. They think in terms that what we know is what we experience. If it didn't happen to us, we don't know it. You find, for example, all forecasting, economic forecasting, by the typical idiot, the typical official editing idiot. And they all believe that this is the way things work. That it comes to a breaking point, it builds up to a breaking point. It doesn't take into account the fact that somebody who's looking at the future rather than the present is saying what's being done in the present is assuring us of what is going to happen down the line. So that the way world wars happen, they happen like in the case of Bismarck. They start with a small incident, but at the beginning of that incident itself, the intention is by imperial forces to get to a general warfare. We are in the same thing now. Right now, what happened in Libya, the President of the United States is a traitor. What did he do? He went into Libya, or Syria rather. He went into Syria, or Libya first, and then Syria. He went in there to start a war. Now, the President of the United States has no authorization to conduct a war without the consent of Congress. So this president committed an act of treason by conjoining with a foreign power to connive against the United States itself, the United States Constitution. He's a traitor to the United States. That's what this bum is. He's an accomplice of the same people that launched 9/11 in 2001. That operation was done by who? By Saudi Arabia and the British. 9/11 was done by Saudi Arabia and the British. And the key figure in the guy of picking some of these people who flew the planes against New York City and so forth was done by British. It was the BAE, a British-Saudi joint corporation, which organized the masses of money through oil deals and otherwise to conduct the attack on the United States in September of 2001. Immediately, the Bush administration and its people who ran it ordered the shutdown of any treatment of evidence showing the connection between the British and Saudis and 9/11, the original one. The same thing happened with the case of in North Africa, the same thing. An illegal war was pushed through on the basis of a British-Saudi operation. The entire Al-Qaeda operation is a British-Saudi operation in which the President of the United States is fully complicit, consciously implicit. That's what's going on. And we, like damn fools, are talking about the news, which is reported from yesterday's newspaper, and telling us that's the future. The consequences of what the action is, the consequences of what's happening in Syria, for example, in the Syrian area, it's the same thing. There is no reason, no justified reason, and only a criminal or a fool inside the United Nations could ever condone that operation. These are Saudi-controlled forces operating under these terms, which are running and creating this war in Syria and adjoining areas. They are the criminals. Now we have the United States and the British monarchy and so forth are all promoting an illegal war, an immoral war against Syria, using in forces which are in fact agents of the Saudis. And the whole thing is still the same, Saudi-British operation, which was the original 9/11. These forces are actually the same. These are the enemies of the United States. They're the enemies of civilization. And people are trying to say we have to negotiate with them. Well, yes, you do have to negotiate with them, because you don't have the backing to crush them. These people should be arrested and cleared out. They're nothing but mass murderers. They're criminals. They belong in a criminal court for their treatment. But we, like our gutless wonders that many of our politicians are doing nothing about what is a completely known crime. Nobody of competence in the international intelligence services doubts that. Any competent intelligence service knows this whole thing is a farce. And they know that the President of the United States is actually a traitor to the United States. That's what you're dealing with. The question is, do you have the guts to deal with it? On the first level of guts, do you have the guts to admit that you know that you don't reject it? And secondly, that you insist, as a citizen of whatever country, you insist that that be understood in those terms. Why are we allowing people for so long, beginning with an infamous creature from Britain, and going into wars which are illegal, as in the Second Iraq War? The Second Iraq War set off a whole pattern of this, which led into what happened with 9/11 and similar kinds of things. And you had the installation of Obama as president was done by these factions in Britain. He was nothing but a piece of meat used by the Queen of England. That's what all he was. Tony Blair, one of the worst skunks that ever slithered across the landscape. These are the facts we have to deal with. Now, with the way we try to deal with them, diplomatically, in other words, strategically, you try to handle the problem. But you apply the exact amount of force to handle the problem without actually provoking more than you intend to take on. If nations would agree with Russia and China on this issue, we could solve it rather quickly. But you have to admit that what the problem is, you have an imperial British Saudi alliance against, in fact, the United States. Because it was that interest in the United States and Britain which launched the original 9/11, which was a British Saudi operation, conducted inside the United States under the direction of the Saudi ambassador to New York, to Washington. So in this time, when you get into this area, you're not talking about nice explanations. You're talking about hard realities. And if you want to be able to deal with these things on the level of politics, you've got to understand the politics that are required of you to deal with these kinds of problems. And what we want is an agreement among other nations. If Russia and China are in agreement with the United States government, these problems will very quickly go away. The drug problem will not go away that simply. But the strategic situation, the strategic threat, which is a palpable threat right now, that can be taken away.
Wow, thanks. I've got a cultural question. Well, what I think it ends up being a cultural question. Regarding the Connecticut shooting and some other things. You've pointed in this and then on some of the Monday shows to the mental instability of the younger people in the country, with various statistics saying that up to, maybe around half of those under 25 years of age are exhibiting various signs of mental health problems. Now, the Connecticut shooting is being treated generally as a gun control issue or sometimes as a mental health screening issue, treatment issue, but the broader cultural backdrop against which it took place is being ignored. So it's true that dramatic cuts in public mental health services are being made. California's cut 21% out of its budget, for example. But even as President Obama was weeping his crocodile tears over the victims in Connecticut, he continues every week to engage in meetings where he plans out targets for murder by drone. According to law schools, Stanford and NYU, the number of civilians killed by these drone strikes is conservatively in the several hundreds. We've also read recently of cruelty and neglect in NHS, National Health Service facilities in Britain, where patients have been reported to have been starved or dehydrated to death through inattentive or intentional healthcare providers. Some doctors are even prescribing drinking water as a prescription to ensure that the paperwork goes through and the nurses will actually make sure these patients get water so they don't die of dehydration. And there's a lot of outrage about what's being reported, about what's taking place in these hospitals, as a callous disregard for human dignity. But it's actually not a shocking event if you look at the overall cultural direction that we're going in, such as the greenie intention. If you truly believe that the world is dramatically overpopulated, it's a little bit hypocritical to then be concerned about the well-being of people. In the United States, or overseas rather, at this point, suicide is killing more of our soldiers than combat. The U.S. Army reports so far this year 303 suicides or potential, investigated suicides compared to 212 combat deaths in Afghanistan. Striking the special forces as well. Years of continual war against an ill-defined enemy in theaters often without a clear objective. This takes its toll. So let me ask you about what is the fallacy of thinking that would be involved in people looking at these issues individually, as a gun issue, as a healthcare issue, as a mental health issue, as opposed to a global question of culture and economic direction towards a significant and a meaningful future, such as NWAPA would be a starting point for.
No. Well, you've got two categories of issues to consider in this place. First of all, the story which led to the gun control matter is a complete farce. The problem is that you have probably up to 60% of certain categories of young people in the United States who are suicide cases, or potentially. They become suicide cases because they are totally depressed in various ways. They're psychiatric cases. Now, in former times, we used to have a regard for mental health problems by providing institutions who would watch out for these kinds of things, especially among young people, like children in school at various ages, or people who have graduated or are still youth. And that's the great concentration, which is estimated as about 60% or something in that direction of people who have mental health care problems, but they have lost what used to be considered the required mental health care. And that was the case in this case in Connecticut. That simple. It was a mother-son problem, which led to the son, who had gone over the edge to get a gun from somewhere in his family's possession, and do this job, then killed his mother and killed himself. I don't know what the exact sequence was, because it was some doubt about that in the first place. But the point was, this was not a case of gun control. It was a case of mind control. Because I had a disturbed young man from a rather wealthy family, a scion of a wealthy family, and it was the only cause for his going out and killing, and he did the killing. The only cause for that was his mental health problem, which was essentially unattended as it should have been. He was like a bomb ready to explode, and somebody lit the fuse, and like a family argument or something like that. The exact details are not that well known, but do you know the case? We've gone through this with people who are experts in the New York area on this kind of thing, and we understand the nature of the area. What the president did was committed a fraud. It's to say this is a threat from guns against all kinds of things and so forth. He's just committing a fraud. He commits frauds all the time. Don't expect the truth from this president. He's not capable of producing it. His rage is more important than anything for him. And so forget it, that part. What you're dealing with is we have created a society which increasingly we are destroying our own youth, in particular, as well as others. The lack of jobs, the lowering of standards of life, the impoverished social relations which are going on in this nation, which are all a product of the post-Kennedy USA. Because the whole problem started approximately 1 to 2 years after the war in Indochina was launched. We already then began to get the drug patterns and other kinds of patterns, which led into 1968, so you got the 68 phenomenon. From the 68 phenomenon, which was started 2 years earlier, actually as a phenomenon, and was attributed largely to being a Vietnam War byproduct. The population, the youth population of the United States has become increasingly insane. The large reason is chiefly not bad parents or so forth, it is social circumstances. But it's the fact that life, with the assassination of Kennedy, and what every American with any brains knew was a fraud. That is, the assassination of Kennedy was not what it was represented to be. And the cover-up of the assassination of Kennedy, and the later attempt to cover up the assassination of his brother Robert, defined a period in which younger generations, intermingled with the war in Indochina, began to go mad. Most of the marijuana and similar kinds of drug addiction in the United States came from that period and came out of, as a byproduct of that circumstance. But then you have with the 1991 process, and that was the end of any reasonable government in the United States, and that led to this hell. 2001 is the key point of this thing. That was a breakdown. It was a sudden breakdown. People had lost confidence because of what was done against, the president then, and he did not react well. Later, he got involved into supporting the bailout process. I had a big argument with him on that one. I said, you do not go with the bailout. And he said, well, I've been to woodshed before, and I've survived. In reply to my rebuttal to what I said to him on that occasion. So that's the problem. We have this condition of insanity. This goes together with the idea of general doing everything to make the situation hopeless. But don't try to take the facts by the New York Times, so-called, and take that as being serious business. That's a fraud. Well, you have to understand, this president is nothing but a fraud. I don't even know what his citizenship is, actually. And there's no proof given to me, available to me, which says he was born as an American citizen. No evidence whatsoever. It'd have to be proven. And everything about him says he is, in general, a big lie. He is, in totality, essentially a big lie. He is nothing of what most people believe he is. Nothing at all. And that's the way you have to look at it.
Well, that's a conclusion to the questions that we have available tonight. I would just, picking up on what you just ended with, say that, number one, the continued attention that we've drawn to the facts behind Benghazi, the constantly updated fact sheet, and the leaflet that we have available now saying, Obama, you must answer the question, what did you know and when did you know it, is critical, and we will continue to intervene with this. And then I will just call attention to what you said in the beginning, that there is no higher priority than the immediate implementation as soon as this week of the full 3-step program starting with Glass-Steagall. So I think our marching orders are very clear, and I would like to thank our viewers for tuning in tonight. I'd like to thank Mr. LaRouche and Jason and Dennis as well. Thank you for watching, and that brings a conclusion to tonight's webcast.